I was hoping to at least start with about 50 participants. Well, if I include the panelists, I think we've got a strong enough mass of people of that 50. So good morning to everybody, and thank you very much for taking time out to join us this morning as we try and take stock, I guess, of the economic responses to the onset of COVID-19, the implications that has had for the health response, the reopening of the economy, but more importantly, I guess the implications that it has for the new normal and the path that is implied by that new normal by way of the energy transition, climate justice, from a macro-fiscal perspective as well, some of the implications of that on the ability to think through some of the, I guess, social wage implications of the current macro-fiscal moment. And of course, all of these things that we're talking about have distributional consequences. The impact of COVID-19 has not been felt in a uniform fashion, and I think we would have seen in some of the data that came out for the hard lockdown that the burden of adjustment to this new normal has in the main been disproportionately felt by women, and we'll be taking a look at some of those issues throughout the course of our conversation today. Just briefly, I guess, on the housekeeping front, I already see some of you have already started to send through some of your messages on the chat, and we'll certainly try to respond to some of those messages. I know some of you are on Facebook as well, and we'll certainly have to try and get some form of, link between some of the comments that you are raising there, and so that we can have them factor into some of our discussions this morning. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and I certainly ask everybody to mute your devices if you haven't done so, and certainly do also share some of your comments, questions, or any other inputs that you might have on the chat, and we'll certainly try and attend to some of those throughout the course of our discussions this morning. So just to give you a sense, of course, of some of our panelists this morning, and they are largely joining us from the Institute for Economic Justice, and it's a real pleasure that we have the opportunity this morning to interact with some of the work that's been undertaken by the Institute. So it's a real pleasure for me to also introduce Neil Coleman and Gilad Isaacs, who are co-directors at the Institute. We also have Carilee Osborne, whose work focuses on just taxation policies and the intersection of human rights and economics, as well as climate justice. We also have Sonia Phalatse, whose work is in the realm of feminist economics, and also other interests in the private financing of development initiatives. And then we'll also be joined by Busi Sibeko, who is a researcher at the IEJ working on macroeconomic policy, issues of tax justice, fiscal and monetary policy, and working towards participatory budgeting approaches that bring together both civil society and many other interested actors in the budgetary process. So my name is Ayabonga Cawe. I'm a broadcaster and an economist as well. And I also have the fortune of sitting on the board of the Institute for Economic Justice. And I'll be facilitating the conversation this morning. And I think just as we kick things off, it's great to see that for some of those who just joined us. So welcome once again. I think we've got about 55 people on Facebook as well. So a big welcome to you all. And I guess, maybe a good starting point is all of us are very familiar with the implications of this. Ideally, it would have been nice to have this conversation in person. I certainly would say that after months and months of not having a lot of social contact with people. But I guess the reality is that we're still grappling with this public health crisis and the economic implications that it has. So a good starting point might be to first maybe frame the issues around what happened prior to the onset of COVID-19. Well, what kind of economic and macro-fiscal path were we following? And what were the implications of that? If we think back to the February budget, it seems like a lifetime ago. And seemingly a lot has happened since. And I guess a good starting point, and I'll start off with you, Busi, is just some of your sense of where the macro-fiscal path was prior to the onset of COVID-19 how the pandemic has shifted it with its attendant lockdown measures and everything else that's come with it. And I guess how it's framed the kind of debates that we're having in the current moment.
Thank you, Ayabonga. As we know, prior to the crisis, South Africa was already in an economic recession and we were not performing well at all. And since 2014-15, the government had systematically been cutting spend, particularly non-interest expenditure, which means spend that is everything but debt. And so we've been seeing a systematic cutting of budgets, and in particular health, which is what I'll focus on for this particular conversation, given that it's about COVID-19. And so what that saw was that between 2014-15 and 2018-19, government was basically increasing healthcare expenditure just above population growth, which was not sufficient to deal with the inequality between the private and the public healthcare system. And so we came into this crisis with a system that was overstretched and underfunded. As we know from 2018, there were 38,000 vacant posts in the healthcare sector. So of course, this cutting of the budget is not just within health, but I'm just using health as an example to show you the scale at which how government had been implementing fiscal policy, which is cutting budgets to deal with debt, which is detrimental to the economy at large.
And I guess, I mean, you know, when you mention all of those issues, be it the vacancies in the public health system, cuts to non-interest expenditure, all of those things have a ripple impact on how the economy is experienced by people. And Neil, I want to bring you in here because I think certainly for the last few years or so, you've certainly been quite close to some of the debates around a comprehensive social security, the implications, of course, of alternatives such as a work guarantee. And one would think that, I guess, the pre-COVID macro-fiscal environment in many ways would have, I guess, foreclosed the exploration of some of those alternatives or even the possibilities of having a thoroughgoing social security program that could, as many have suggested, also have very strong implications for employment. Is Neil on the line? Where's Neil?
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you.
Thanks, Ayabonga, and good morning, everyone. So yes, you know, I think we need to also understand that what we call the crisis before the crisis, which existed in February this year, before the COVID crisis hit, was a very deep structural one in which the majority of the poor and working class communities were heavily hit by lack of income security, unemployment, poverty, and so on. I mean, and we know that this is a long-range structural problem which we've been experiencing since the dawn of democracy. Over the last 26 years, the growth path which we inherited, you know, from the apartheid economy has been exacerbated. We've introduced new features, but in essence, we have continued to be very dependent on our commodities. We've seen an increasing problem of financial speculation, which has led to growing financialization of our economy and a growing services sector. But we've seen a deindustrialization. So what this has meant is that a deepening and worsening of the structural features of the apartheid economy, the cheap labor path, and the structural fault lines of unemployment, poverty, and inequality concentrated in the Black majority and the female majority has, you know, worsened over this period. So the creation of the Black middle class and limited deracialization at the top has really happened on top of this distorted and inequitable economic structure. So when we come to the crisis before the crisis before COVID, we see an unemployment which has doubled from 4 million in 1995 to over 10 million in the first quarter of 2020. And we see long-term unemployed, over 40% of the unemployed who are actively seeking work have been unemployed for more than 3 years. We see 60% of the population living in poverty when measured by the upper bound poverty line. But also, it's not just the unemployed living in poverty. The National Minimum Wage Research Initiative found in 2015 that over 40% of full-time workers in South Africa are living below the working poor line. In other words, they're working full-time, but they're living in poverty. And then the issue that you raised about social security is that in this context of this deep poverty, inequality, and unemployment, the majority of our people are not covered by any form of income transfer. Those aged 18 to 59 are the missing majority. Only the children and the old age pensioners getting income grants. And therefore, we're talking about over 10 million people not covered by income transfers, because only around about 7% of unemployed are covered by the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is a contributory scheme. And the recent introduction of the national minimum wage, while it's improved the situation to a certain extent, is not enough to fill all these gaps in the absence of larger scale job creation or a general income floor, together with the problems of rising food prices, the expense of energy, public services, etc., has put rising pressures on the poor and the working class, which has led to a crisis of indebtedness. So this is the sort of perfect storm, if you like, the combination of all these toxic realities which existed before COVID came onto the scene. So yeah, that's a very picture which the majority of our people have confronted.
I mean, it's interesting, Neil, that you frame it as the crisis before the crisis with a big C. And maybe I would even say that preceding crisis was a more persistent one, and one that had a more sort of chronic strain on our economy and our social milieu as a country. And one of the features of, I guess, the apartheid growth path that you're speaking to has always been, I guess, the role in social reproduction undertaken by women, and the implications, I guess, of some of the economic relations, not only in the workplace, but even in the household. And we've seen during the COVID moment what impacts that has had, gendered impacts. And Sonia, I want to bring you in here because I guess the point I was making earlier was that all of these shocks, be it the persistent and chronic one, all have distributional consequences that are not uniformly felt across different demographics. And I'm quite interested, I guess, in your view, prior to the onset of COVID-19, the situation as it presented itself for female workers, female work seekers, and even, I guess, if you think about it in the context of the household as well, and the major implications that path had on the ability to extend care work and on some of the unpaid care work that is undertaken within the realm of the household.
Thanks, Ayabonga. And coming out of Women's Month, this year's celebrations felt a lot more somber than usual. This year felt like there is a lot less to celebrate. We've seen the statistics. Women, particularly Black women, have felt, the heavy blow of unemployment, of hunger, and just general precarity, which has worsened since the onset of the pandemic and the lockdown. And so as Neil and Busi have already spoken to before the lockdown, our economy was in recession, and unemployment or underemployment took on a very gendered and racial shape. I guess this is an illustration of the very deep structural and historical failures in our economy that show that macroeconomic policies and the economy in general is not gender neutral. And I think this has two implications that has been underscored by the pandemic in two very stark ways. The one is that the centrality of care work, as you mentioned, in maintaining and sustaining our economy. So prior to the pandemic, high value adding sectors like manufacturing that employ many women were neglected, and a range of critical infrastructure and public services were also neglected and underfunded. And these sectors support positive public health outcomes, right? And when they are neglected and underfunded, it puts an even heavier burden on women's labor and time to fill that gap. And on top of that, the care work, which we know is heavily gendered, has increased substantially since the lockdown. And late last year, Oxfam released a report that showed that women in South Africa particularly undertake 5 times more care work than men. And yet care work remains very much undervalued by our economy, by being underpaid or completely unpaid, and care workers are very much overworked. The second implication is that economic outcomes, as I mentioned, affect women differently. And in periods of downturns, this is exacerbated. So, for example, we saw the NIDS data set that was released a few months ago that you mentioned, Ayabonga. Of the 3 million people that lost their jobs early in the lockdown, 2 million of those were women. Hunger rates in women-headed households have increased substantially. And really the concerning thing is that the very activities that are needed to not only sustain human life and well-being, but also to sustain our economy have been systematically undervalued. And so issues like unemployment, lack of access to water, adequate water and sanitation, gender-based violence, it's particularly difficult to effectively provide care when the conditions surrounding you make it difficult to do so. So I wonder what this means about the state of our economy and the very social fabric when society is less and less able to provide sufficient care to its citizens, and when women in particularly are overworked and underpaid. And this is what feminists and feminist economists call the crisis of care. And so the pandemic has really worsened this crisis of care in South Africa and very much brought to the fore the very deep structural inequalities that desperately need to be resolved.
And it's interesting, I mean, that you sort of link some of the structural challenges that we have in our economy and the implications that those have for the social fabric of our society. Because, if you then embed on top of that the ecological dimensions to this crisis, and Carilee, I want to bring you in here because, I mean, even prior to the onset of COVID-19, you had massive challenges. I mean, I'm currently in the Eastern Cape now, area that has had prolonged drought for the last, say, 5 years or so. And all of this has an impact primarily on many of those who are reliant on the natural environment for their livelihoods and for their sustainability. Carilee, you might want to maybe make a brief comment on that, and then we'll take a look at some of all of the other issues that I guess underpin and underscore the kind of ideas that give rise to the structure of the economy that we've discussed.
Absolutely, and I think we'll probably come back to how we envisage the solutions to this in relation to that a little bit later on. But I think that what we really are trying to emphasize here is how interrelated all of these problems are. So some of the problems that Neil spoke about in terms of the deepening of the apartheid and colonial structure, the dependence on extractive industries, what Sonia has just discussed around the heavy burden on women in particular, and the under-emphasis on the care economy, and the very deep ecological crisis that we're seeing in terms of climate change, the drought, and the kind of broader ecological crisis that we see in terms of lowering biodiversity and all of that. All of these things are not separate crises. They're all the crises of the kind of economy that globally and in South Africa in particular we've been emphasizing for the last few years. So I think what's really important is to say that whilst we might separate these as we discuss them, they're actually all part of a very deep crisis of the kind of economy that we've been emphasizing.
Yeah. It's interesting, I mean, that you mentioned that, I guess, the kind of choices that we've made. I mean, this is not some divinely created economy that we've inherited, like manna from heaven, but it's, an outcome of very intentional political economy choices over a long period of time that have had and created their own type of path dependence. And Gilad, I want to bring you in on that question because I think many people have suggested that the COVID moment has opened up debates and discussions, even in the public discourse and in the mainstream, that challenge the economic orthodoxy. And you teach as well, and I'd be interested to hear what you make of how we've dealt with, in the realm of ideas, but also in not only just scholarship, but policy as well, with some of the challenges that have been thrown up by the moment. I mean, I think of, the debate around debt sustainability and how the role of evidence, the role of scholarship and ideas is factored into that debate, and certainly by no stretch of the imagination a concluded matter. But what's your view, I guess, on how this pandemic, if at all, has really challenged the prevailing economic orthodoxy, which has given rise to the context that all of your colleagues have already outlined?
Excellent, thanks, Aya. And just to say, it's really great to be here, and having scrolled through some of those in attendance. If we were in person, I would wave to many of those who are friends, colleagues, and it's also—
You can wave now. You can wave now.
Hi guys, hi. I am smiling at our various board members, at our various partners, and also to see some new names here, as well as old friends and old comrades. So thanks very much, everyone. I think that is a valuable segue, to try and think, okay, how do we make sense of some of what we've heard from everyone now? And I think we've looked at this current moment and thought about three kind of overlapping key elements of South African economic structure at the moment, which give rise to what we've seen both before COVID and in our economic response to it. The first is what you say in terms of the economic orthodoxies which have prevailed. Busi's mentioned reductions in spending. Sonia's mentioned the ignoring of social reproduction. Neil's mentioned various wage paths. And I think those are all underpinned by a particular economic mindset, right? And that economic mindset is one which is market-centric, one which imagines that if we create a stable economic environment, there'll be this private sector-led investment, right? And that's been a paradigmatic approach which has failed to advance us to where we need to be. In addition to those orthodoxies, I would add two other features. The first being the failure in state capacity, which we've seen widespread, and we'll talk about some of these rescue measures, but I think we've seen that failure both before this crisis. If you think about the preparedness of the Eastern Cape health sector to be able to actually manage something like this, and obviously we've seen that in the rollout of various rescue measures. And that's not unrelated to the economic orthodoxies, because part of that orthodoxies is a underfunding or outsourcing of state functions. The third element I would just add is corruption, and I'm not sure if you'll take us there later. But no doubt that itself has also interacted with those first features. The perpetuation of a closed structure of the economy has meant that a new layer of Black society has not had legitimate opportunities for accumulation, right, for entry into business, because of the monopolistic, closed, white-owned, narrow nature of the economic structure, which is linked to those orthodoxies, right? And so the state becomes a vehicle for economic access. And of course, that's not linked to the, not unrelated to the second feature of state capacity. And so I think that kind of confluence of the orthodoxies, the state incapacity and corruption frame how the pre-crisis crisis emerges, and I think frame some of our responses and inadequate responses in the face of COVID.
And Gilad will certainly return, I guess, to that theme of corruption and its interface with, I guess, outsourcing and shifts in procurement and the implications, of course, that has for redistributory policy. I mean, if you think about what came out of the Auditor General yesterday with regard to UIF TERS payments, and you marry that to what we had with CPAS and Net 1 in the social security realm, it does certainly have implications for all of these things that we're talking about, especially insofar as they have an impact on many of those who are the working poor, and many of those who are in poverty, and many of those who feel the brunt of the distributional consequences of how we've structured this economy. I want us to shift our discussion slightly. And I want us to take a look at, I guess, the early stages of the response. I mean, we had a state of disaster announced around the 20th of March, somewhere there, a subsequent lockdown about a week later. And I guess a big chunk of that first part of the response was about really trying to respond to this growing number of cases of COVID-19, so primarily a public health response. But of course, with that, there was also some form of sort of income relief and income replacement that came through. And I'm quite interested, I guess, Busi, in your sense of what you make of that earlier phase, because I guess a lot has subsequently happened since. But I think at that point, many people were still thinking, this is going to be around for 3 months. This is not going to be with us for as long as we probably know now. What was your sense, coming as it did, of course, just a month after the budget was presented in February, of how that first phase of that response panned out, and more importantly, I guess some of the more sort of critical pitfalls of that particular moment?
Thank you, Ayabonga. So firstly, with the response that was announced by the president of 500 billion, it seemed sizable. It was about 10% of GDP as it was announced. But as we analyzed the supplementary budget, we realized that it was really a proposal filled with smokes and mirrors. And because the reason why we argued this is because ultimately what we had been promised and what had materialized in the budget were different. And I'll give you a quick example. In the supplementary budget, or in the announcement, 100 billion was allocated to job creation and protection. But really what happened is that in the supplementary budget, only 6 billion was allocated to this year. This really goes against the ideas or evidence of what works for responses in this kind of crisis. The kinds of measures that work in this crisis are ones that go early, go big, go household. And most importantly, they're timely and targeted. And in the South African context, not only were we lagging behind in terms of our response, but by the time that we heard the supplementary budget, majority of the money had not been spent. But not only that, just to add on to what Sonia said about reproductive versus productive work, you can see that our 500 billion is actually directed more towards productive work and really focuses on the formalized components of our economy as opposed to reproductive work. And so there was 50 billion allocated to social security, but what you see is that with the COVID special grant that was introduced and the caregiver grant effectively is what it became, it was very punitive to women because it said that if you are a caregiver, you do not qualify for the special COVID grant. And so these are the sorts of things that we had to navigate when analyzing this budget, because what it had seemed and what was materializing were different. And even now, as we are seeing all these reports of corruption and so forth, it's really critical to think about how much of that money money has made it to where it is needed most. There's obviously been delays in the way that SASSA has implemented the grants that were introduced. And I mean, of course, as we know, they were definitely not sufficient. Only 10% of the 500 billion was allocated towards households in terms of social grants, if you think of it that way. And so still a large concern. And I think this really follows in the orthodoxy in thinking around, you know, who needs to be supported in the economy, how do we support them? And it's really indicative of the austerity that we've been implementing over time. It's reflected in this package, which is really not sufficient.
And I guess, I mean, you know, when you put it like that, it does also foreground what Gilad was saying earlier on about the hollowing out of institutions and the implications that that has had in a moment where these self-same institutions are expected to lead and frame the response. And so, yes, you know, it might sound very good that there's income replacement occurring through the UIF TERS, but if the systems don't make sure that that money gets to where it's needed, where we need it the most, it certainly does, Carilee, have a massive impact on a final demand. And I think many have argued that primarily in South Africa, we suffer from a demand challenge. What's your view of that early period? And I think Busi's also touched on the special adjustment budget. And I'm quite surprised about how much misinformation has been doing the rounds. There's a sense that the 500 billion has been chowed, you know, somebody, you know, took all of the money in an overnight raid. And you know, that's a very prevailing sentiment outside in the public domain. What is your view about that? And maybe if you can also just briefly address just that notion of the 500 billion being allocated. And we've seen with the loan guarantee, effectively a flop. We've also seen, I guess, with also some of the other social security and income replacement measures, nowhere near hitting, I guess, where it's needed the most.
Yeah, absolutely, Ayabonga. I think it's really interesting. You know, there was a lot of debate about the IMF loan, right? And the prevailing narrative that I saw on, for example, Twitter was like, oh, you know, the fancy car dealerships in Sandton are going to be really happy that this loan came in, right? Because the idea there was that people had absolutely no faith that so if we take aside the kind of political things about taking an IMF loan in the put those to the side, you know, most people just thought this is just going to be like not used properly. And I think that really speaks to what Gilad had spoken about earlier and maps onto what Busi had talked about with the grants, that we have this problem of underfunding of resources, which comes from the economic orthodoxies. And we see that in the rescue package, that it's kind of was presented as a 500 billion stimulus, but 200 billion of that was loan guarantee scheme, right? And we've only seen, I think the latest figures of around the middle of August were about 13.5 billion of that, right, has been given. So that's really, you know, you're taking out a huge chunk of what was meant to be a stimulus. And that hasn't been said. A whole other part of it was just a reprioritization of existing budget expenditures, right? And then on top of that, we have an inability to actually execute even the parts of the package that were, you know, maybe could have been helpful. And I think the grants situation really maps onto that typology of the problem with austerity, state incapacity, and corruption. We have low allocations to the grants. So in terms of the special COVID grants, 350 Rand a month, that's very low. I mean, it's something, but it's very low. I think we would have all advocated for a much higher level of support. Then the amount of money allocated to that didn't match onto the expected beneficiaries. So it's a lot less than what would be needed if we were covering all the people eligible. And then if we take and then we have the problem of incapacity where SASSA was not even able to roll out even this kind of reduced grant. So I think 6 weeks in, we still had not had anyone paid the special grant. And I think what that also says is, you know, this is supposed to be emergency measures, and emergency measures by definition are meant to help in the immediate term. And I think what we've really seen with this rescue package is that it's not rescuing us in the immediate term when people really need relief.
Sorry, I'm on mute again. It's interesting how you frame that, because, you know, Nkateko on the chat saying, you know, he felt that all the package had the right elements: wage support, extra social security, business and enterprise support. But the issue is that it was too little, too late, and in some cases not implemented. And I think that is the overriding sentiment here, that if you don't fix some of the challenges around state capacity, you're likely to find yourself in a moment where crises are going to become the norm. I think we're in the throes of a planetary crisis now, that if you don't capacitate your state institutions and move away from this idea of just, watchdog regulatory states that don't intervene or that don't build up the necessary capability, then that kind of orthodoxy does come back to bite you very heavily. I want to maybe return to that theme of the financing of the response, because I do think that it does throw up a few macro fiscal questions around debt sustainability and a few other issues. And I'll come back to that. But I want us to maybe just hone in on, I guess in the second phase of the response, the reopening of the economy. We had a very vexing debate around tobacco, liquor, the impact that had on upstream and downstream industry. There was a few other issues around, I guess, the effective stoppage of the economy and the implications that had on employment. And I guess we certainly haven't seen a full return to pre-2019 levels. Interestingly, AXA was saying a few days ago that they expect to hit passenger levels that they had in 2019, around 2023 or so. So certainly a much longer term crisis than what we might have thought around March or so. But Neil, I want to bring you in here around the debates on how the economy reopened. A lot was said about this risk-adjusted approach. And I must say there was a lot of forum shopping, jostling for space, a lot of lobbying that continues even now. What's your view on how the economy has been opened, the approach that has been taken by those empowered to act, and I guess those with the necessary authority to decide on some of these questions, and the impact that this had on the pre-existing economic structure that we had?
Thanks, Ayabonga. Firstly, before I respond to that, I just want to indicate that the IEJ doesn't take the view that everything government has done has been pointless or has failed. I think it's, as you said, it's about putting in place some of the right measures, but doing it too little, too late, and not implementing them effectively. So, for example, the COVID special grant, by the end of July, there were about 5.8 million people who had received that. So, that is significant, but we need to look at the big picture. Sonia Phalatse referred to the CRAMS NIDS survey, which showed that it was those at the bottom end of the labor market, the workers who were paid the least, women, households that were living on the margins in terms of hunger, et cetera, who've been worst hit by the crisis. So, the 3 million jobs that were lost, heavily concentrated in those areas, high levels of hunger and poverty that we're seeing. One of the debates that's taken place internationally is how you relate the battle to protect lives to the battle to protect livelihoods. And what's become very clear in many, many countries is that you cannot separate these two things out, and that an attempt to prematurely reopen the economy to protect livelihoods has both compromised lives as well as compromised the economy in the end, because the disease doesn't allow for that rapid reopening. So as you say, it's those who've had the loudest voices who've been able to lobby for a particular type of reopening. But the view that the IEJ has taken is that the manner in which the economy is reopened, and in fact in which we recover going forward, must deal with what we call the social comorbidities, which people are confronting, because people are not only vulnerable to COVID because of their health status, because of diabetes, high blood pressure, et cetera, but because of where they live, lack of running water, overcrowded transport, businesses not adhering to health and safety regulations. So you see the COVID outbreaks in informal settlements and workplaces with lower income workers in, mining, for example, in healthcare, in retail and services, in part because of bad implementation of health and safety protocols, but also because of the realities under which people are living. So the issue is not you know, of course, there must be a managed reopening of the economy, a safer and more equitable reopening of the economy, but that must happen in a way which addresses these social comorbidities, which addresses these realities that people are confronting. So the IEJ has suggested a number of interventions that can help to begin to do that. You know, at the level of returning to work, to ensure that there's proper union and worker oversight of health and safety measures, proper enforcement of compliance around health and safety, the right to work, refuse to work in unsafe conditions, but also to more equitably share the costs and burdens of reopening the economy. So what we've seen internationally is that some of the frontline workers have been given a wage premium because they are taking these huge risks to protect our lives. We need much greater support by the state for furloughed workers who are not able to work because of the situation that is beyond their control. We've had the situation in Germany of Kurzarbeit, where, you know, there's a deliberate shortening of working hours, so you can share the work that's available in this crisis, but the state has to step in to begin to be able to subsidize and support that situation. So the question of working hours also becomes quite important, but the issue of our wage structure is equally important. So these huge gaps that we have between low-paid workers and management, CEOs, etc., has been very sharply brought into relief in this period, and it's been welcome that some companies have said that they are going to take wage freezes at the top and begin to redistribute the wage bill downwards, and that's a sort of intervention that's required systemically. And finally, of course, Ayabonga, you need to do things to mitigate the health vulnerability of people in communities and workplaces, to mitigate social vulnerability, you know, through extending the social grants, as we've spoken about, improving access to water and sanitation and PPE. We're seeing now with these strikes by Nahawu and the health workers that the entire system is, you know, under enormous stress because of the lack of the adequate support in these sorts of areas. And of course, you know, the question of targeted support for women who are taking a disproportionate burden in terms of care of communities, of households, and expanding community childcare, etc., etc. Can't go into all the details now, but we've published a policy brief which sets out a comprehensive approach to that. And of course, we need a state which is much more responsive and caring to people's needs, much less repressive activity by the security forces, which is really inappropriate in the conditions that we're confronting now.
No, definitely, Neil, and we'll come back to some of the, I guess, mechanisms in the latter part of our discussion of how we can make sure that you know, we give effect to some of that support that responds to some of the challenges in our socioeconomic context, brought about not only just by COVID-19, but as we said earlier, I guess it also predates COVID-19. Now, there's an interesting question in the chat from Unwabi Sanondenja. And I guess it does open up the macro fiscal can of worms. And Gilad, I'm going to start with you. And Sonia, I'll also get you in to respond to this one. So her question is, one of the reasons put forward as to why the 500 billion rand package ended up being much less than what might have been expected or promised is the issue of South Africa's ballooning debt to GDP ratio, constrained fiscal space, and how the country would be able to pay for any substantive stimulus package. Well, what's your view on that? I mean, Gilad, I guess there's a very strong sense in the public discourse that, you know, there's that sweet number where beyond that number, you get yourself into, you know, a sequence of events that might get you into a Latin American debt trap or anything like that. I guess theoretically, a lot of arguments have been put forward for why that view is held by many of those who make policy decisions in this country. What's your view on that question? And also, I guess, in the context of some of the relief that South Africa has sought from the likes of the IMF, the World Bank, African Development Bank, and others.
Excellent, thanks. I think it's worth thinking through what are the risks and opportunities which we face on the financing side, right? And the main sources of financing being in tax revenue and in borrowing. Okay, so on our tax side, we do face a risk of a fall in collection. Because of the fall in economic opportunity, and we do face the risk of that. This is not a time when one wants to hugely increase corporate taxation, okay? Because you, especially not on smaller and medium enterprises who you want to be offering as much relief as you can. At the same time, there are opportunities there. We have an under taxation of wealth. We have various loopholes for large corporations, large amounts of illicit financial flows. So there is room on that side. Some of those measures are going to take a medium term to, or at least there's some lag of a year or two to implement, which means that some access to financing through either market financing or through the use of quasi-state funds, like in the pension funds, is necessary. And if we look on that debt financing side, again, there is risks and opportunities. We do not face the risk of a particularly high debt to GDP ratio coming in to this crisis. We were sitting at just under 60%, which was about the emerging market average. So there certainly was a perception, but an incorrect one, that somehow South Africa was at a level that was unreasonably high. At the same time, we
Hi, Gilad. Only one who can't hear Gilad anymore.
were on an upward
okay, he's back now.
trajectory, and importantly, we have high levels of borrowing costs. Payment of our loan.
Gilad, maybe try.
Gilad, we're losing you. Maybe you might want to go step outside or switch off your video or something. Or pick up your router and, you know, just plunk it up somewhere. So I think maybe just as we try and reestablish that connection with Gilad, Sonia, I mean, a similar question for you, just on the issues that Gilad has been raising. But I want to overlay maybe some of the monetary issues as well, because we certainly have seen, you know, quite a interventionist by the SARB standards, interventionist approach into capital markets to try and stabilize borrowing costs. And I guess in response to, you know, some of the panic that happened around March or so. What's your view, I guess, just in, you know, to overlay on what Gilad was saying, but also on the monetary dimensions of this particular response and what you make of it?
Yeah, Let me start by saying that, there's a lot of debate raging about the IMF and World Bank loan. I think we should be very wary of accepting loans from IFIs like the World Bank and the IMF. As we know, historically, these institutions have been instrumental in prescribing very harmful economic policies to sovereign countries that have had particular detrimental effects, particularly in the global south for women, for marginalized communities. And admittedly, in the current context of COVID-19 and the relief funds, they did come with low interest rates, but as they always say, the devil is in the details. So for countries like Nigeria and Ecuador, for example, accepting loans from the IMF and the World Bank did indeed come with very stringent conditions for consolidating debt and austerity policies, which we've already discussed does little to solve the socioeconomic issues and in many ways fosters the regression of human and social rights. And as Gilad spoke to, essentially IMF and World Bank induced policies prioritize debt servicing costs over, basic care for citizens. And the finance minister's supplementary budget speech, we have this ever looming threat of a sovereign debt crisis, which has been repeatedly foregrounded and has been used to rationalize accepting an IMF loan without any public engagement and transparency in the processes prior to accepting this loan, right? And so it's very important that should South Africa accept another loan from an IFI like the World Bank, that these loans, that these processes are democratized prior to taking on the loan. And just on this point on debt, I think it's really important that we rally behind, alternatives to borrowing. So, for example, debt standstills or complete debt cancellation is no longer, a lofty goal given the extent of the current crisis, right? The diversion of public resources in times of crisis to debt repayments is unacceptable, really. Unfortunately, President Cyril Ramaphosa, as chairperson of the African Union, is leading the call for targeted debt relief in Africa, which I think is really important for countries, to be able to focus on, rebuilding resilience instead of, scrambling to pay off debts first, and frees up fiscal space for economies to focus on spending in other important areas.
We certainly know that that's a very, a current debate, not only for us here at home, but if you look at the Zambian context and some of the deliberations they've had with the Paris group of lenders, it certainly does complicate things somewhat. Gilad, I want to come back to you. I certainly hope you're on a much better connection now. I was saying earlier on, maybe you need to pick up your router and take it outside and reestablish the connection, but you probably don't need to. But that being said, there's also the other dimension, which is the monetary dimension. And I want you to pick up on the point you were making about our debt to GDP ratio. And also, I guess, the terms on which we borrow and the ability of the central bank to intervene in some of those markets. We've seen them intervene in the secondary markets, for government bonds. And seemingly there's been somewhat of a retreat, I guess, in the last a month or so in that activity, with the central bank governor saying, they only intervene to make sure that the markets function, and when they feel that at least there's some semblance of normality, then they will retreat from that. Should we be retreating? I mean, if we anticipate that this crisis is probably going to be, an 18-month to maybe 3 to 4 year crisis.
Absolutely, thanks. I was actually, I'm load shed at present, so illustrating other structural crises in our...
We'll come back to the energy transition.
Economy. And I am hotspotting successfully off my phone, but then received spam calls from a bank which I won't name, which highlights other frustrating crises in our lives. But I think where I was going with that, and I'll summarize in brief, is that the real fiscal danger in South Africa is on high levels of borrowing costs, and therefore on the share of our budget which it occupies. There is no magic level above which your ratio is unsustainable. If you look at what's happening in advanced economies, there's a huge expansion in borrowing. In many instances, it is twice our levels, but it's at a extremely cheap and sometimes negative rate, which is not where we are now. And that links to what you're raising now, which is the room for monetary policy. And the Reserve Bank has unfortunately not taken the aggressive stance which it needs to reduce the South African borrowing costs, which would essentially involve a far larger quantitative easing program. And this is not something that we've only seen in advanced economies. We've seen it in a number of other emerging markets, far in excess of what we've seen here. And so that's an essential leg in the monetary policy, but also in the integration between fiscal and monetary policy. There are other ways of accessing funds at lower rates, whether that is through quasi-state pools of financing like the government employees pension fund, or whether that's through prescribed assets. So, you know, I think the starting point from where we are now on the fiscal side needs to be a realization, like we've seen elsewhere, which says that if South Africa underspends now, we will see a sustained fall in economic activity, and that sustained fall has significant detrimental medium-term risks. And therefore, given that we need to see a sustained spending in the next 3 years, 5 years, let's say, after which we must see some level of a reduction in borrowing, what is it which we must do to allow for that, right? Whether that's on our monetary policy side, whether that is what Sonia's mentioned in our debt relief, whether that's an increase in taxation, whether that is through other parts of like funding. And that's not the conversation which we're having. The conversation which we're having starts by default with the position of fiscal consolidation. And unfortunately, that's likely to produce a larger economic harm than a benefit.
And I guess it's, you know, this is a perfect segue into some of the conversations that we're going to have, because, you know, I think, you know, with Gilad in the darkness there, it does also sort of throw up a lot of issues around our public expenditure envelope and the implications that that's going to have by way of not only allocations to social security spending and even income replacement and other forms of household support, but even support to some of our state-owned entities. We saw with Eskom coming out with some of their numbers in Parliament over the last day or so of how much their debt is. Some of that, you know, is payable in some of the capital payments are certainly payable in the next while. And Carilee, I want to bring you in here because, I mean, I'm quite interested in how this idea of a just energy transition, and maybe let me use just transition broadly because there's other structural transformations that have to happen even outside of the energy industry. Where does that fit into how we think about this reconstruction and recovery phase of COVID-19? I mean, you can't have an economy if you don't have energy, nor are you able, I guess, to presciently plan if you're going to have intermittent cuts in energy, and you'll wake up and they'll tell us we're in stage 6 or stage 4 or whatever stage they often announce.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really interesting because at the beginning you said to me that, you know, one of the reasons we got here is because of choices. And I think that's really important to emphasize, that we have choices, and the choices that we make are going to determine the kind of economy that we have coming out of this. And so the way in which we've thought about this is around a kind of just recovery. And a just recovery incorporates elements of a just transition, which is about transitioning our energy system and our economy away from kind of being very much a carbon heavy. So South Africa has two kind of unenviable characteristics of being one of the most unequal and one of the most carbon intensive economies in the world. And so what a just recovery does is try to address both of those. And what it says is that in this kind of COVID moment, we have to clearly change a lot of our economic policies. We have to make choices about how we fix our economy. And what we really argue for is that those choices need to be geared towards the kind of intersecting crises of our time. And that is about the energy crisis, and that's about Eskom's inefficiencies as much as it is about the kind of carbon intensive nature of the energy system, and that's about addressing our inequalities. And so I think Sonia is kind of best placed to talk about the Eskom and energy stuff in particular, but I think what's really important to emphasize is the fact that these all go together. And the way in which we've sort of thought about a just recovery is that there are sort of 3 phases to a recovery: the response, recover, rebuild. Right? And we've talked quite a lot here about the response and some of the inadequacies of the response. But I think that for us, we really need to think about those 3 things in conjunction with each other. And so Sonia and I kind of led a report on this, on what a just recovery for South Africa looks like with 350.org. And I think what we really try to do in that is to show the way in which policies that address these issues, policies can address the kind of interrelated nature of these issues. And so if we take the kind of different phases of it, one of the aspects that we talk about is about reclaiming public services. So we can take public housing, right? In the initial response phase, what we need to do is say, well, we're going to protect people against evictions because people have lost their incomes. They might not be able to pay rent. We don't want people being forced out of their homes. We want homeless people. I mean, we always want this, but in particular, during a pandemic, we want people to make sure that they are sheltered, that they are safe, that they're not being exposed, you know, to the virus. And then if we move into the kind of recovery phase, maybe what we want to say is we want people to be able to, like, you know, rebuild their incomes, to have jobs, and we want those jobs to be geared towards a kind of climate just future. And that means that we want people to be installing water tanks. You're saying you're in the Eastern Cape, people have had a drought. We need to have people having access to rainwater tanks. We want them to have solar panels. And then in the kind of rebuilding phase, what we really want to do is say we want massive public housing projects to be put in place that mean that in the long term you have jobs for people building those houses, maintaining those houses, that those houses are low carbon, and that it gives people a kind of a place to live and can build communities. And so I think throughout all of those phases, it's really important, and there are kind of choices that we can make around that. And of course, laid onto this is also questions of the care economy. We want to be creating jobs which are around, you know, nurses, teachers, community health workers, which are inherently low carbon jobs. They stimulate demand, right, in local economies, but they also provide sorry, I've just lost my train of thought there. But they provide services for communities and make people's lives better and improve well-being. So I think that's really the way in which we think about this. And I think it's important, you know, what I was also going to say with the public housing example is that we saw this week a really major victory in Cape Town for our comrades at Reclaim the City and Indefuna Kwazi, which is really saying that we should be around the Tafelberg site and the sale of that by the city of Cape Town, which is kind of emphasizing that we should be using public land for public housing for people and not for profit. And I think that's really what we're trying to emphasize with the various aspects of a just recovery.
And I guess there's interesting dynamics to that because, you know, all of this presupposed that there is the necessary alignment, coordination, and capacity across different tiers of the government. to be able to implement this where the rubber meets the road and where it means something for people. And Sonia, just some of your views, I guess, on this idea of infrastructure-led recovery, not only just in terms of the provision of very needed work for those with limited or no skill, but also, I guess, some of the institutional and governance challenges that might face that kind of push and its ability to play a critical role in the recovery.
Thanks, Aya. And I think linked to your question is this emphasis on the role of the private sector in this recovery, particularly in energy and infrastructure. And I think the emphasis in particular the private sector involvement and privatization generally of basic public goods has, come to the fore as the economic situation worsens. We have been told that public resources are too limited and simply aren't enough to induce or catalyze enough economic development on its own as a government. And the basic principle is that public sector money, needs to be leveraged to de-risk investments in social goods and infrastructure to make them more attractive for private investments. And I would like to highlight, two concerning aspects of this. There's no doubt that public spending can crowd in private investment, and the private sector should play a role in this infrastructure development. And there are opportunities to do this at an appropriate scale that can assist the government in reaching the recovery, our development goals. However, I do question the overwhelming narrative from Treasury and governments that tell us that there's no other option but to incentivize private investment, which, as Gilad spoke to earlier, obscures other alternatives for state revenue collection, such as increased tax and clamping down on illicit financial flows. And I think what is really missing from this analysis is an acknowledgement of the various inherent tensions among different stakeholders. So, citizens, consumers, unions, and so forth, instead of, uniformly assuming that admitting greater private sector competition in sectors like the energy sector or infrastructure more broadly will uniformly benefit everyone equally. I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, Sonia. And I do think that, some of the deliberations around the, the district development model, if we overlay them to some of the big debates we're having here about the energy transition and infrastructure-led recovery, become very, very critical, because it also then brings to bear the debate around prescribed assets and, how much pension funds ought to be financing some critical social and economic infrastructure. And we'll come back to that theme towards the tail end of our discussion. But I want to maybe bring something that's certainly been burning up our chat platform here, which is the universal basic income and the interface between that and a work guarantee. And thank you very much to Julian, Pat, and to the other colleagues who have certainly been taking on this discussion. And Neil, let me bring you in here. As I said earlier, you've certainly made a lot of noise around this particular issue. Just, I guess, some of the same questions, institutional questions, financing considerations, making sure that actually the money gets to the people who need it the most, who have a much higher propensity to spend it than maybe some of the people who are on the upper end of the income distribution. What's your view on this? And in light, of course, of the debates that have happened in the African National Congress, within government, about a universal basic income, but also non-market forms of employment, which I think is something we've been talking about here. This idea of not only just reproductive work, but also thinking about socially necessary work in our communities as part of some of the public employment driven responses to this particular crisis.
Thanks, Ayabonga. I've just been load shed, so let me know if...
you too.
Let me know if I'm breaking up, and I'll switch my video off. And quite a lot of noise around here as well, so hopefully you can hear me clearly. Yes, I think, a number of the questions around the idea of a job guarantee versus a basic income grant. This has been coming up a lot on social media. the idea of a job guarantee is like in the Indian system, the Inrega, where you have every household has the entitlement to have someone work for a certain number of days, say 200 days a year. And if they do not get the work, then they get, they have a right to the equivalent income. The IEJ has done a policy brief on this, and we'll put it on the chat. It's a very interesting and useful idea, but it shouldn't be counterposed to the idea of a basic income grant. They, in a way, they have different types of functions. It's a problem that they've been counterposed now, because the reality is that with current problems of capacity and the very urgent need to roll out income support, the idea that we can roll out a employment guarantee over the short term is probably quite unrealistic. So in the medium term, the idea of an employment guarantee is a nice idea. We have our public works programs, community works programs. Those must continue and must be improved. But the idea of a basic income or universal basic income is particularly important in this context, because as we saw with the COVID grant, if you have a means-tested grant, in other words, that you can only access or qualify for the grant if you have below a certain prescribed income. What that does is it creates a whole bureaucratic nightmare where people have to prove income. The bureaucracy then discriminates and distinguishes between different groupings of people. And what you often find is the most vulnerable and the poorest find it most difficult, ironically, to access those grants. So a universal income, which is guaranteed, which you have a right to in terms of the law, that's well-founded in our constitution as well, is very important, because it removes the bureaucratic layer, it removes the discretion, but it also makes it much easier to implement. Can you imagine if that COVID-19 grant, which has been extended, had been extended as a universal right to everybody? Then the SASSA, the whole bureaucracy, would not have to distinguish between someone who is entitled to it and someone who's not entitled to it. It becomes a much simpler and cheaper system to implement. The question people ask, of course, are twofold. One is, why should someone who has a job or who's has a high level of income qualify for a grant? And the second is, how do you finance it? On the question of the discriminating between people on the basis of income, the issue is that you do that through the tax system. So in other words, people earning above, for example, it would be quite easy in our situation, people earning below 80,000 Rand a year do not pay income tax. It'd be quite easy in our situation to say that everyone earning below 80,000 it would be entitled to a grant, and those earning above 80,000 would pay it back through the tax system, that your millionaires and your multimillionaires would then pay multiples of the grant and cross-subsidize it. This is the basic idea which the Basic Income Grant Coalition put forward in the early 2000s. And this is very easy to implement through the tax system. The question now is that the COVID-19 grant, as Pat Horn and others have pointed out, expires at the end of October. Can we have a situation where at the end of October, those 6 million people who are now relying on that grant, as small as it is, suddenly find they have absolutely nothing? The reality of our social security system, as I indicated before, is that those between 18 and 59 have no access to any form of income transfers. So we're now facing a crunch moment where the decision needs to be taken by government to extend that COVID grant, but also to improve it beyond the end of October. And the IEJ's preference would be that that is then transformed into a universal grant for everybody from age 18 to 59. The problem now, Ayabonga, is that information that we have been given is that this extension of the special grant has not been incorporated into the October budget yet. So if those provision is not made for the extension of the COVID grant beyond October in the medium-term budget policy statement, which is going to be put forward to Parliament at the in October, then we're going to sit with a serious crisis. So ourselves, together with civil society organizations and trade unions, are now beginning to put this matter on the agenda very seriously, that the COVID-19 grant needs to be extended and transformed into a universal grant. The reason to do that between the ages of 18 and 59 is that we already have the child support grant up to the age 18, and we already have the old age pension from age 60. So in the medium term, the idea would be to transform the entire social security system, and we need to look at that together with retirement funds, et cetera, and look at how those articulate with a basic income grant. But we don't have the luxury of transforming the social security system now to begin to tamper with child support grants, old age pensions, et cetera. That would create a real problem. That is why the proposal from the Department of Social Development to now focus on a universal grant for those aged 18 to 59 is the correct one. And we hope that civil society and society as a whole will mobilize around that proposal. On the question of financing, sorry, did you want to come in there?
No, you can carry on.
Yeah. On the question of financing, a number of proposals have been put forward, including from some business people about tweaking the taxation system. There's actually a lot, and Gilad sort of referred to this, there's quite a lot of fat in the taxation system currently. A whole lot of subsidies, for medical aid, retirement funds, et cetera, tax allowances, a lot of fat in terms of wealth at the top, and so on and so forth. So there have been a range of proposals that have been put on the table. Is this idea of the tax clawback that I mentioned, which could finance a significant part of the grant. But it's now, the rubber's hitting the road in terms of serious dialogue that is needing to take place. We've heard that there are discussions between the ANC Social Transformation Committee and the ANC Economic Transformation Committee. This needs to be opened up more broadly to public engagement. There is, of course, the discussions that are taking place at NEDLAC. But we think that other organizations like the C19, like all the trade unions, et cetera, now need to come together. And the IAJ is beginning to embark on a modeling exercise to look at the financing alternatives that can take this proposal forward.
Thanks for that, Neil. And, just on that comment of the fat within the tax system, I remember, I think 2018 or so, it was a World Bank report that came out. And one of the issues that they raised in relation, I guess, to the just transition and the structural transformations we were talking about was the existence of all of these tax and non-tax incentives that go primarily to heavy industry and the mining sector. And maybe that might be worth thinking about as we think about some of the lead firms that we want, or lead sectors that we want to emerge beyond the recovery and reconstruction period. Busi, let me bring you in here just as we get, I guess, to the tail end of our conversation. And I'm also monitoring the chat, so certainly we'll pick up on some of the questions there as we wrap up. But I think all of the discussions that we've had certainly imply, or I guess assume, a very sort of fluid and a shifting macro fiscal context. And then in the next few years or so, we frame the space for some of these debates that we're talking about. What's your view on, I guess, the macro fiscal shape or frame that needs to be taken as part of this third phase of recovery and reconstruction? If we accept, of course, that the challenges for final demand that have been brought about by COVID-19 go beyond just a 3-year cycle of some of the measures that have been announced.
Thank you for that
3-month
question.
cycle, I should say, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are two major elements that we need to discuss about a way forward. It is clear that we need a fiscal stimulus, at least to us, having written and researched about what austerity has done to countries in crisis. And therefore, it is evident what we really need to go forward is a stimulus. And I think in replying to this, I want to speak about two elements. The first is how we think about the role of the state, and the other is our immediate needs. And the first is really about no matter how conducive the environment is in South Africa, which is sort of the structural reform pattern or the structural reform narrative that we're going about it, we will not build a new economy from more of the same. And we need to embrace and think about and reimagine our macroeconomic policy in general. But importantly, we need to rethink what the role of fiscal policy is in our developmental agendas. There's a great paper, it talks about how austerity is neoliberal dreams come true. And what this paper really speaks to is this idea that what austerity does is that it reduces the role of the state in the economy in itself. And we see here what's happening in the South African context with austerity being implemented. We know that in the budget, from the supplementary budget, the budget was only increased by 36 billion net increase, which is obviously less than 1% of GDP. But we also know that over the next 2 years, they plan to cut the budget by 230 billion. And so when we think about South Africa's constitution, which lays out the role of the state, we need to think about how it interlinks with how our budget is being framed as a way forward. But also we need to think about the economic rationale, right? What is the role of the state in terms of fiscal policy in growing our economy and ensuring that it's fiscally sustainable, but just generally sustainable. And so we definitely need a pro-employment macroeconomic policy, which needs to be reimagined. The second is about our immediate needs. I like this quote by Ilan Strauss, where he says that if a patient is in ICU, you need to give them the much needed medicine right now and not a healthy diet and exercise, because that will not save them right now. And in South Africa right now, we are the ICU patient. We can't be thinking about, the long-term fiscal sustainability. It's important, of course, but what do we need to save South Africa right now? What is the cost of not doing anything right now? And I think that is really critical. We need to boost short-term demand. And the way that our government can do that is to introduce a sizable fiscal stimulus and one that really thinks about how do we spend today to change how our economy looks tomorrow. And it's not literally, but I think it's very important to think about it this way, that we're not proposing that we spend for spending's sake. It's really about how do we spend today so that in the future we are building a different economy from what we have. So introducing things like a sort of a caregiver grant is one of those foundations that we're already thinking about, right? If we were to extend it, that are changing how we think about our economy or how our economy looks in the long run. And so I think those are the critical things that we need to start engaging with about what are the immediate needs. And obviously we need a fiscal stimulus to boost short-term demand, but also for long-term structural transformation, which Gilad maybe will touch on later in this conversation. But, and really to challenge National Treasury about their role in the country, in the economy, in delivering human rights, in upholding the Constitution of South Africa. Thank you.
Gilad, how and what we spend and the impact that might have tomorrow, and maybe, yes, I know it's not tomorrow per se, but what impacts that's going to have for the future, not only growth of the South African economy, but also its distributional profile, because I certainly don't believe or hold to the mantra that it's just growth at any cost, because even that can have catastrophic social consequences. If we think about this third phase, and some of the structural and broader transformations that need to be undertaken. Carilee spoke earlier on about the ecological and energy transitions. There's the infrastructure-led recovery that everybody's talking about. Where we're spending this money, how we're spending it is going to be as critical, I guess, as some of the aims that this money is being spent towards. Some of your views on that, and maybe also if you could just touch, I guess, on how we think differently about corruption. You touched on it earlier on, I guess, as a social process that is an outcome of a very sort of insider type economy. But how do we think about some of those issues and the political economy considerations that raises in this crucial moment of the third phase of the reconstruction and recovery efforts.
Excellent, thanks, Ayabonga. And Busi's already very eloquently, laid out some of this groundwork. So I'll build from that. I think if we look at the paradigmatic debate going on in society now, what we see from the Minister of Finance and others is a particular view of the role of different parts of economic policy, right? And I know I'm straying slightly from what you've asked, but I'll return back to it. And that view is essentially separates two things, okay? What it says is that we need a macroeconomic policy environment which is stabilizing, okay? Which generally refers to low borrowing in debt and in deficits, low inflation, liberalized capital markets, and a number of other sort of key elements. And that's the role of both fiscal and monetary policy. At the same time, what we must do, therefore, is implement structural reforms. And those reforms will intervene in microeconomic spheres of the economy. So in transport, in energy, in water, and together, what this package is supposed to do is increase South Africa's competitiveness, right? That's the sort of paradigmatic approach. And what I think Busi's started to lay out is to say that we actually take a different approach. We see the role of fiscal and macro policy as being deeply integrated in supporting a certain type of transformation of the economy, right? And we would speak about structural transformation, and structural transformation that is environmentally and socially sustainable, okay? And that would refer to us moving away from a low value added commodity and service orientated economy, which is reliant on unsustainable environmental policies and unsustainable levels of exploitation, both in production and social reproduction. And what we're looking to move towards is the kind of economy which is a diversified one in higher value added, more productive sectors, in which manufacturing is revived, and in which has environmental and social sustainability at its core. And that both of those arms therefore need to be integrated and need to be more actively thought through in that process. And therefore, macro policy has a role to play that is beyond simply creating this competitive environment, right? And the micro policy reforms are also not simply about creating an environment in which capital will invest, right? But are far more active about selecting industries which have long-term transformative potential, a far more directive role for the state. Now, of course, this runs up against what you've raised secondly, which is the question of capacity and corruption. And I don't think we should fool ourselves as people who see a developmental role for the states. We also can't wish away state failures, right? And assume that we come up with these policies and the current architecture can implement them, right? So I think that means a few things. Firstly, I think that means targeting particular interventions in areas where the state can quite easily and readily implement them. And there are areas of the state which are highly functional. At the same time, it means investing in the state, right? And having an acknowledgement that we need to structure, reorientate skills to municipal level, have far greater training courses, you know, and a whole range of other capacitation elements, which will not occur within a framework of a reduction in fiscal expenditure. On the corruption side, you know, I'm no expert here. I think I'd like to hear your views and other colleagues. But, you know, we will never address corruption unless there are sustainable alternative paths for engaging in economic activity. Corruption is not this individual failing which bad people engage in. Of course it is sometimes, and of course there are people who, you know, have like no regard for social concerns. But it's a systemic feature of the economy, right from the municipal level up, precisely because the economy excludes the majority of people. And so that's why I link the kind of structural transformations which we need to the undermining of corruption. At the same time, of course, we need prosecutions, the strengthening of the MPA. What's come out of the ANC NEC seems positive, you know, and a range of other institution building mechanisms, including in SARS.
Look, I mean, I certainly would share that sentiment is an outcome of a stunted nation and state formation project in this country, and so that the dynamic of exclusion that you speak to, I think, is a critical part of it. But I also think the other element of it is this change in the state at multiple levels from being a vehicle for the achievement of the tasks of national reconstruction towards being just a transactional actor in very polarized local economies. And you end up seeing this where, you know, many officials end up, especially those who would work in functions where you have to create specifications for work and you have to think quite intentionally about some of the issues Carilee raised. So for instance, if you're going to be building a road, or if you're going to be building a new settlement, how do you make sure that that's labor intensive? How do you make sure that that is ecologically responsive? All of that kind of work is so undercapacitated, going back to your point of capacity, that what you end up having is local economic interests influencing the specification of those bids in a way that is very narrow and that can, I guess, meet immediate needs of accumulation. So in a way, it does speak to the hollowing out of the state as a consistent project and that even predates the democratic breakthrough. And I do think that if we want to speak about corruption just from a perspective of moral outrage, we might overlook some of these critical issues around sort of nation and state formation and the stunted processes that give rise to some of these issues. So I think there's been a lot of issues coming up, and I think Kateko Mabasa also mirroring a similar issue. They're saying economic orthodoxy, including privatization, has led to poor state capacity, corruption, which are then used to justify further privatization. And Sonia has also been working on a report dedicated to ESCOM, which will be released soon, which might be of interest, and we'll certainly await that report. It's now 23 minutes before 1 p.m. and I guess, colleagues, this is a perfect opportunity to bring our discussions to a close. I'm quite delighted that many of the IHA folk have started to share links to their policy briefs, and I encourage many of us on this call to continue with the conversation, be it on social media, but also go to the website of IHA where you can find some of the publications and the policy briefs. And also big thank you to Maverick Citizen and Comrade Mark and the team for really putting together this partnership. It's the start of a series of conversations we're going to be having. And so I would encourage all of you who have expressed interest in these conversations to continue to follow the Maverick Citizen, and as we continue to have these conversations, form part of them. But I really want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining our conversation, and also thank all of the researchers who've put in a massive amount of work into allowing us to think differently about some of the issues at play. I think we must cede no ground in some of the issues that we've raised. The debates continue, the jostling for space by different interests continues, and I think we need to make sure that all of the things we've been speaking about today remain on the agenda. And so I'd like to thank everybody, and thank you to all of our participants for taking time out of their schedules to join us for this very, very important conversation. Thank you very much.